Just to review what I introduced last week is that basically there is in the world there's a movement forwards. There's a perception that there is a development of the human being forward. In terms of, let's say, science, we gain more knowledge of science. There's also development in terms of the perception in our world that we are more moral than the past, that our behavior, back then there were barbarians, now we are more moral. You know, they used to have slaves, now we don't have slaves. The perception is there's some progression. And that's articulated in various philosophical concepts. Hegel is very big into this in terms of moving forward and so forth. So the fact is that we live in a world that sort of says there's progression. In the meantime, we, from a halachic perspective, look back to a specific event in history that reflects that was the only event of revelation. Revelation was not continuous. Revelation was a one-time event. And theoretically, we look back to the indication of what's right and wrong. And the perception being is that there's no progression on a simple level. There's no progression. There's a perception of it being the ultimate expression of what's right and wrong was at Har Sinai. And as I mentioned to you, in the way a Professor Silman from Bar-Ilan University expresses in the book, from one view of Revelation, he calls it the classical view, is that all we're trying to do is make sure we don't lose it, in order to try and maintain what was. Now the truth is that in Halacha there's also other movements. I mentioned last week that there are also some issues of progression in terms of we're moving towards Yemos HaMashiach, and there's a perception of the Yemos HaMashiach that we'll be in a better place. We're trying to fix what needs fixing. So there's a tension also in terms of Halacha. We dealt with that, but the point is the big tension is our whole world is moving sort of forward. It's dynamic, and we start off with the concept of static. And what I expressed last week is we're not as static as people think we are. Okay, now in that regard, I handed out a article to you, which is an article I just recently wrote, which originated with the issue of the brach of Shlos Ani Isha. There is it's basically this article here, commentary, my commentary and it's basically called Halachic Movement. And basically, its specific starting point is the fact that there are a couple Orthodox rabbis who made an announcement that they no longer say the brach of Shlos Ani Isha. And this has created a tremendous amount of controversy in various regions of the Orthodox world, from whether they should be allowed to remain as members of the Rabbinical Council of America, to their arguments and so forth and so forth. I use that issue as a starting point to discuss halachic movement. When can halacha change? How does halacha change? Can halacha change? Okay, so this article deals with that and deals with some of the mechanisms of halachic change, but behind that article is this idea of this dialectic between what is perceived to be what is the past and the future. The idea we look backwards and we look forwards. Okay, and the fact is that it seems to be the static perception versus a dynamic perception. The world's moving forward, and we are sort of holding the reins, because we want to look back and say this is what was right. And the point is how do we work within this tension? And every contemporary issue that we deal with really is defined by that tension between looking backwards, looking forwards, where we look to the world and we see this movement forward, and we see what's happening along the world, and yet we are looking back to halacha and sort of saying, there's our yardstick. So how do we balance the two?
Aren't you comparing apples and oranges, though? One is a moral sort of experience or a moral condition, and the other one is civilization.
Well, civilization is a moral condition as well. In every issue that you take, there's a morality, democracy, human rights, same-sex marriages, homosexuality. These are all, if you talk about it, I mean, the fact is that the proponents, let's say, of same-sex marriage argue it from a moral perspective, that it's wrong to deny these two individuals their rights. And it yields to new definitions of morality, okay, or quote-unquote quotations around the word morality. But we can talk in terms of democracy. Yeah.
Like when Mashiach will come, for example, are we going to reinstitute the Malchut Beit David? Are we going to lose our democratic rights that we're used to in society today and have to go back to system
right.
of Malchut?
Well, the thing about that is that, you know, the way to sort of circumvent that issue is by saying, hey, we're talking about the Melech appointed by Kodesh Baruch Hu, by God, and so forth and so forth. So he's for sure going to make the right decision. I mean, it's almost like.
No, there's no question of that.
Right,
the question is, what's the system going
right.
to be like as far as the population?
And you're right, because the fact is the democratic system is not just a matter of political authority. The democratic system also touches upon your rights as an individual. Okay, what you're really going to lead to, which is the topic I want to specifically talk about or introduce tonight, is authority versus autonomy in terms of making decisions of what's best for you. Let me phrase that in a certain way from a real democratic idea. There's a person out there, I'll give you an example of a dilemma. There's a person out there who's a remarkably talented doctor, and he has, you know, if he worked in medicine, he would find cures for cancer or whatever. He's remarkably knowledgeable, you know, he's like top-notch in biology and medicine, so forth and so forth. He wants to go play the violin. You know, that's what he likes to do. He wants to do this. Okay? So he, you know, one day, let's say, whatever it is, he makes the decision, I don't want to do this medicine stuff anymore. I don't like it. I want to go play violin. Okay? So someone comes in and says, no, you have a responsibility because you're so talented and so capable and you could save a lot of lives. You have a responsibility to be a doctor. So how do you look at that? Just if you think of it from a democratic perspective, and this is one of the issues that was always balanced when you talked about the communists versus Americans. In America, you can do whatever you want, which means that I don't care if you got the mind of Einstein, right? If you want to play violin, go play violin, right? But under the communist system, the benefits of society have priority. What do you mean? You can save lives. You can do that. Now, the truth is that that's an issue. Now, one of the ways we circumvent that issue in terms of democracy is who has the right to tell you to do this, or how can you do this? So the point is maybe you're not as talented as everyone thinks you is. But in a system where you have the return of Malchus based of it, and the president of Kodesh Baruch Hu is there, and basically there's Nevi'im and so forth and so forth. If someone tells you, hey, you should be a doctor, and he's speaking from a Kodesh Baruch Hu, what do you do with that democratic right? But I want to play violin. Well, God says you have to go be a doctor.
But HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to speak to every individual person. It's only going to speak to the right ones who are meant to be.
So therefore, if God tells you to be a doctor, yeah, then really you know that really you don't want to play the violin. So it's a little bit of a difference in the sense that what they say, when Churchill said that democracy is a terrible form of government, but it's the best one we have, it's usually because even if you have a benevolent dictatorship, how does the dictator really know what you need? It's like it's still dependent upon him's perception of benevolence. But if a Kodesh Baruch Hu is that benevolent dictator, then you assume that, hey, he'll really know what's good for you. But it does yield different types of questions. Or let me frame it another way. The Vilna Gaon says that one of the greatest things about Nevi'im, okay, is that if you wanted to, when you're ready to marry, you should go to the Navi and say, hi, okay, who am I supposed to marry? Okay, and it's Jane Doe down the street. Okay, over in Tveria, that's supposed to be. Go knock on the door. Excuse me, is Jane here? Yes, Jane. I just spoke to Shmuel and Navi. We're to get married. Okay, why? Because Shmuel Navi says I'm supposed to marry you. Okay, now, what would you think of that type of arrangement? The Gaon says it's a real problem in our world today. We don't have any Nevi'im to tell us who we should marry, what to do. Back then, you want to know who to marry, a big decision like that? It's great, you went to the Navi. But can you imagine the dating system in terms of walking in, someone walking in the door and saying, "Hi, just spoke to the Navi, we're getting married." Okay. Hey, what's the problem? The problem is you would like to feel that you have some kind of say in this, right? Some sense of saying it, right? No comments on this, right? Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people would rather have that way.
I think there'd be less support.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe you're sitting to say, "Hey, it wasn't such a bad idea," because that's what the Gra says. I think it's the evidence statement he says that. But the fact is that there's no doubt that there's some aspect. Well, I want to make that decision, which really reflects the aspect of autonomy.
Oh, sorry, I have another comment. But if you look all the way back, right?
Yeah.
Torah, Abraham, Yitzhak, wherever you want to look. Even they have, they sent out Eliezer to go find. It was never, when do we see that Hashem sent a Navi to tell someone this is who you're going to marry?
Okay, so here you have an interesting issue. No, but there's an interesting issue. Okay, you have two different models of shidduchim, if you want to say of how to get married in Chumash. You have the Yitzchak Rivka model, and you have the Yaakov Rachel model, right? So the Yitzchak Rivka model is the classic shadchan, right? The person makes an intelligent choice. The shadchan makes a rational decision. This is the best woman for Yitzchak, brings her home, and this is it. Yitzchak didn't make a choice. We decided, wasn't even Avram. Avram said, "You saw." Eliezer made that decision. But the question is, how did Eliezer make that decision? So there's a big machlokus in the Forshim. Some of Forshim said, basically, he knew he had to get a real Baal Rachamim. So he said, "I'm going to give a test, a rational test, and if a woman acts like this, I'll know this is a woman who's befitting for Yitzchak." Okay, and Rivka passed that test, that she wanted to feel the Gemalim and stuff like that.
There's also going to a place where there's a higher likelihood of finding people
exactly, because that was an interesting issue. But you knew that if he came from the family, she had good genetics. I mean, Rivka came from the family of Ram, so it was at least good genetics. There's another shita completely different. Eliezer basically said, "What the heck am I supposed to do here? How am I supposed to do it? God, listen, you got to do me a favor. If a woman does this, I'm going to take it as a sign that this is the right girl." Nothing to do with rationalism. Basically, he was Seimech al Nas. There's a lot of before ask the question, how could Eliezer be Seimech al Nas and so on. But basically, it was a symbol from God. With the other model, Yaakov and Rachel, was exactly different. It was, basically love at first sight, no shadchan, nothing like that, right? It was basically he went out and he found the girl himself. Okay, but there's a big machlokus in the Meforshim of which model is really the best model. So there's some people who say Yitzchak Rivka was the best model. He said other shadchan. Yaakov unfortunately had to run away from Esav. So Yitzchak couldn't send out a shadchan to pick the wife for Yaakov. So Yaakov Nebuch had to go pick it for himself. That's one viewpoint among the Forshim. There's another viewpoint among the Forshim, which is the opposite. Yitzchak couldn't leave Eretz Yisrael because he was a korban, right? Okay, with the Akedah he developed sanctity of a korban, so he could never leave Eretz Yisrael. So the fact is, other Meforshim say he couldn't leave Eretz Yisrael, so therefore he couldn't pick it for himself. So Rahman al-Litzlan, Abraham had to send someone else. Two different models, and Meforshim arguing back and forth about which is the more correct model. But one of the things that hit us is the fact that I would say that in our perception, we would like to have an idea, because of the concept of autonomy, that we are making the decision. Right? We like to have some aspect that we would like to make the decision, and that's really at the root of democracy.
The first one off, both models, the first one off the Shidduch model also gives the autonomy to the individual. You don't have to accept the Shidduch.
Yeah, you're right. You're right, but it's less autonomous. It's less autonomic.
Don't we believe in Bar Sher?
Okay,
that
so
even though we think we're making decisions and we're allowed to go out a little bit, in the end, this is what a coach Baruch wants for us.
That's a different. That's an interesting issue.
He's making the decision just as if he makes the magic.
You're mixing up two aspects of Beshert. There's an interesting statement of Beshert that says that you are supposed to marry so and so, right? But that now there are viewpoints, right? Before they announced so and so married so and so, right? Which is interesting because how come 40 days before the birth of the guy, who's 17 years older than the girl, it's announced that. Okay, fine, but we won't get into that issue. But the fact is that you have this statement. So what exactly is that statement? So it's true. There's some Hasidim who believe, there's Hasidic Shofar that says this is Kodesh Baruch Hu is going to tell you what happens. So the woman you marry, okay, from man's perspective, is really your beshert. What's the sign that it's a beshert? It's because you married them. Okay, so the truth is that the marriage really is an indication that it's a beshert. In that perspective, divorce becomes a really problematic thing because if
it's beshert,
if it's beshert, not like that. Like I know a story. I know that and we'll get to this in a second. But I know of Chaim Lifshitz. Chaim Lifshitz was the from Yerushalayim. He was from what I said, he was Meshkiach Ruchani in Keren B'Yavne for many years. And he was also a person who studied by Piaget in Switzerland for 5 years. Okay, so he was a top-notch psychologist. And when I heard him speak, he was like the psychologist of all the room in the world. So he told the following story. He said there was a Gerach Chassid, because when Gerach had problems, they used to send him to him as a psychologist. The Gerach Chassid was married for like a month or two, and he said, oh, he wants a divorce. So they sent him to go talk to him why he wants a divorse. So he says, I finally pulled the trump card. Didn't you ask the Rebbe that you should marry her beforehand? Right? So didn't the Rebbe say you should marry her? So what do you think the Chassid said? The Rebbe knew I should marry her, and the Rebbe knows that I should divorce her now, 2 months later. In other words, I projected into God. Okay. The point is you can project, but the fact is that you say Beshert, but there's another viewpoint of Beshert. The other viewpoint of Beshert is this is who you should marry. But that doesn't necessarily mean you do marry that person. There is the possibility. Just because you marry the person doesn't have to marry the person. I'm sorry? Okay. And the fact is, it's a Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden says there's an idea of Zivik Rishon and Zivik Sheni. Zivik Rishon is the first person, is theoretically Zivik Rishon. It's easily translated as the first person you marry and the second person you marry, and the Gemara says by the Zivik Rishon, the Mizbeach cries if you have to divorce, and so forth and so forth. So most people define it as first one you marry, the second one you marry. The fact is that Rav Yaakov Emden says that's not what it means. Zivik Rishon and Zivik Sheni is talking about the nature of the bond. In other words, there's some bonds which HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates naturally. These two people should be together. And there's other ones, Zivik Sheni, where theoretically the HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to take two parts and put them together really who aren't meant for each other. But he says, if you want to put it in the colloquial, it's one neshama and split in two. And then the Zivik Rishon is when you put the two parts together. The Zivik Sheni is when you can't find the two parts together, you take another part and try and fix them together, but it's never the same type of connection. He says, what? He says, so Rav Yaakov says, but don't think it's based upon the first person you marry. He says, who's the Zivik Rishon of David and Melech? Who's the Zivik Rishon of David and Melech? Michal? Bathsheba? Abigail? Which one? Right? He says, I don't know. He doesn't know. I don't know. I mean, the fact of the matter is, he's saying, it doesn't go. It's not a time thing. It's the way it works. I mean, most people say Bathsheba. David wasn't her first husband, and Bathsheba wasn't David's first wife. So the point is that when you look at this, it's hard to define. It is an aspect of autonomy. What you're saying, you do make the choice when the shadchan comes to you. It's a matter of how much you want to be involved in the decision making. The aspect of democracy of what you're talking about is the fact that we want to be involved. Now, that actually leads into what I wanted to specifically do today, because this really is part of the issue when we look back to Revelation versus the movement forward and so forth, is if you look at it, it's a question of how do you figure out what's right? How do you know what's right? Okay? So if you buy a classical vision of Revelation, then right is already defined. HaKadosh Baruch Hu already tells you what's right. Right? So all you got to do is accept it. You've already been given the answer. Right? Okay? And then the challenge is that the ultimate value is accepting authority. Right? The knowledge, the aspect of what's right is outside of you. There's a statement of authority, and your challenge is to simply accept that authority, which means basically the subservience to the authority, which was the classical religious model. Right? That religious model was subservience to authority.
Isn't that the same ideas as absolute values versus relative values?
Well, it's somewhat of a similar issue in the sense that because absolute values can be absolute, it becomes of authority. If God tells you A, you got the right answer. Relative values comes from the fact that you got to try figuring it out. So the possibility of having 3-4 answers because you don't know the right answer. So let's say use an example like psychology. In psychology, you have all these different theories of psychology. So therefore, if you're a behavioralist, you'll come to this conclusion. If you're Freudian, come to that conclusion. That's really what relative morality is based on. It's not just simply, you do your thing, I do my thing. It's the fact that we have a lot of different ways of explaining the world, and therefore it leads to various different conclusions, and we can't say absolutely for sure what's the right answer. Therefore, we can look at the various possibilities of right answers. Right? So relative morality really, from an intellectual viewpoint, really is that there is out of the world of thought, there's a possibility of different conclusions. In terms of absolute morality, God already gave you the answer. So that really comes down to it. But really what it comes down to is that in absolute morality, it works with a model of authority. And the classic religious model is to be subservient to the authority. So the aspect of religion is to be subservient to the authority. What we have done, and people don't recognize that, is that out of the world of democracy began with the value of autonomy. Autonomy is basically the value of the human being to make his or her own decisions, and the value of you coming to conclusions on your own. Now, there's a rule of reason, and that started with the age of reason, and so forth and so forth. But it was a challenge to authority. So, if you look at the early advocates of democracy, basically they said individuals have a right to make their own decisions. And the problem is when authority imposes decisions upon individuals. That's wrong. Okay? Now, there's a subtle aspect to this question over here, is that if the authority is God at Sinai, it's not so accepting authority might be difficult, but it's not so difficult to perceive this as the authority, right? The great Bill Cosby joke. How long can you tread water for? The fact of the matter is, if God's telling you it's going to be a flood, okay, this is reality. But if some church father in 1702 is saying this is the authority, this is the right thing to do, guy wakes up and says, how do I know you're speaking for God? So there was a challenge to authority on that level. There was a challenge to authority because there was also a value on individuals making decisions. That God would not want you just to be so subservient. Now, the point is that's when autonomy started to develop. And from autonomy developed a lot of the values that we come about. Democracy, so on and so forth. So that's where you have the challenge between authority and autonomy, in the sense that you have this aspect of a challenge between, looking back and Har Sinai says A, so I just have to listen to it. But on the other hand, you have this aspect over here where maybe there's a value in me trying to figure it out on my own. Yeah.
It's also not so black and white, because Hashem said that here's the Torah, but you're going to listen to your leaders who are going to interpret for you.
Okay.
And also free will.
Well, no, free will is something different. Free will is a choice that you can do right or wrong. See, there's different.
I've been talking about moral decisions. I mean,
yeah, but but there's a difference over here. There's what the perception of democracy is in giving autonomy. It's not simply like free will is you can make the right decision and go to heaven, right? Or you can make the wrong decision and go to hell, and boy, you wish you never made that wrong decision. It's like me telling you have free will. Here's the free will, okay? You can continue sitting in that chair, okay? And if you sit in that chair for another minute, I'll give you $1 million. Let's bleed matter, right? But if you stand up, not only will you not get the money, but 3 guys will come in and send you to the hospital. Okay? You have free will to make that decision. What decision are you going to make? Right? But that's what the free will of Torah is. Free will is very simple. It's basically, hey, you cannot eat pork. And people don't recognize it. Torah says, if you eat pork, you get magos. Right? Here's the free will decision. You can not eat pork and actually get some mitzvah for it and schar for it and so forth and so forth. Or you can eat pork and you get the living dead that's beaten out of you through makot. Now, what do you think? What do you think of that decision? But that's really what free will is on one level. But the point is that what we're talking about here is the fact that we appreciate the concept of free will. From what you're talking about, it's not the free will just in terms of doing what's right or wrong, but we like the aspect that we want to be involved in the decision-making process. We like the idea that we're involved in the decision-making. Somehow we want to be involved in working out what is moral.
But we're more bound to the action that we take or don't take by virtue of it.
But
having made that, so we own that decision. We're committed
and that includes a moral decision.
Yeah.
We want to feel that it's part of our being. And that's part of the issue. In our world today, as you go through autonomy, there's a value, when you talk about human rights and so on and so forth, there's a value of being this type of person. Of being involved actively, even in the pursuit of what is right and wrong, and trying to work it out. The point is, the authority model says, basically, God's already told you the answer, just follow it. Don't even think about it. Here's the right answer, just do it. Right? It's like many ways, and I've heard this story so many times about people when they went to Cheder, and I have no understanding about this, but they went to Cheder, and they were all told, that when I asked the question, my Malamed told me, we don't ask questions, just do. And people understand Nasa and Nishma, we just do. The point is that challenges our own perception that we want to be involved in that process of analysis. That's one of the tensions. Now, the truth is this tension really was at the root of the development of Reform Judaism. Okay, and if you speak to certain Reform Jewish thinkers, I don't know if there's any more like that today, because I don't know how many. I would be somewhat surprised if there's any Reform thinker today who accepts Maimon Har Sinai in any way, shape, or form. Okay, the truth is that my understanding is that most conservative thinkers also do not accept Sinai, or you see it's Mitzrayim. They think that that's just mythology. Okay, but the point, and for sure in terms of reform, in fact, when you get into some aspects of reform, some of the reform rabbis are even atheists. But the point is I remember hearing one reform rabbi once speaking, and basically the way he defined it was at the root of Reform Judaism, and from my understanding, it was really Nasa before Nishma. It was an aspect that Nasa and Nishma is wrong because it does not deal with the power or the value of autonomy of the individual. Therefore, early Reform Judaism basically said you have to have Nishma leading to Nasa. So that's why they say, hey, listen, we got no problems with doing mitzvahs, but you have to have a feeling yourself that you're going to do that mitzvah. I remember speaking, what?
Nasa, the Nishma maybe has a much more profound understanding of human
yes.
psychology than Nishma Vanasa, especially when you're bringing up children.
Oh, okay.
You know,
Okay. But the fact is Nasa and Nishma usually...
You can Nasa first and Nishma afterwards, and later on you can undo the Nasa if you want, if you have the understanding.
It's interesting when you say that in terms of Nasa and Nishma, you do the Nishma afterwards. There's a big difference between Nasa and Nishma and Nasa. Nasa is a simplistic model of authority, right? Jump, how high? That's the question, but basically I'm jumping. Nasa and Nishma is that you'll agree to jump, but then you want to know why. Okay, but the fact that you want to know why has an aspect of your autonomy. It's an aspect of that autonomy and development, that aspect of a person. Now the truth is that's part of the tension. Now the fact is that I dealt with this in this article over here, which is the autonomy and wisdom, the Slifkin affair. That what happened with Rabbi Slifkin, the whole issue there had a lot to do with this issue of authority and autonomy. A lot of the issues with Das Torah today is a lot of the issue of authority and autonomy, because the fact is, and the issues of wisdom are tied to the issues of autonomy, because. See, along the world, what we're talking about is that revelation was an authority. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, hey, this is the way to do it. Right? Okay. Then you have, so the world though is moving forward. And it's moving forward. You talk about Hegel, you talk about the development of science. What's the motivating force behind this movement forward? It's knowledge. It's philosophy. It's thinking. It's the development of wisdom. As you develop knowledge, as you develop wisdom, you move forward.
Forward only in the scientific sense, or knowledge of the world, knowledge of the natural world. That's the only moving.
I'm not sure if that's.
It's to prove knowledge of the non-natural world, that we've had movement of the non-natural world.
Well,
it's a very difficult proof to make.
You're right, but the fact is whatever movement has occurred has been defined within the realm of philosophy and the development of thought. In other words, when you talk about the present position of democracy, that was developed. If you talk about the people who are big in that, and that's Rousseau, Voltaire, who's obviously not a person we want to talk about, you know, okay, or you talk about the American thinkers, Jefferson, and so forth and so forth. This was a process through thought. Now, we can challenge it and say, hey, that thought, where's it going to take us? It could take us out, doesn't take us, necessarily to the right conclusion. But the point is that there's a movement. The movement. I'm not saying it's correct. I'm not saying that it's a movement that's going to lead to the correct answers. But the force is thinking. And under authority, the force is don't question. And there's that tension that's existing between the two.
When you say that, though, how do you explain the Gemara?
You're right. You're correct. You're correct. But you see, the truth is I'm not really giving a correct presentation of orthodoxy right now. I'm presenting a simplistic vision, because what happens in the revelation in Torah is that Kodesh Baruch Hu did not give a fundamentalist vision of revelation. And that's the most unique aspect of Torah. What did God say? God said, hey, I'm going to give a revelation here of what the right answer is. And then how did He give it to you? In a totally cryptic manner. In other words, okay, I want to read the answer. And you read the answer and says, I don't understand what you're talking about, because you have to do this drasha and that drasha, and you have to know this Zeres Shava, and you have to do this and this and this to come to the conclusion. And not only that, it's not even what's written, because what's written could say the car is brown, but Chazal tells you that it's really telling you, right, that you should return the suitcase to the original order. Like how did you get to that? How did you get from A to B? Because Chazal did it from drushes. The truth is, the Kodesh Baruch Hu did a completely different idea with Torah. He gave a revelation, but it's contrary to the fundamentalists. When you read about the Christian fundamentalists who basically say, you got to read the Bible, we never read the Bible as a fundamentalist work. Right? That was the issue with the Karaites. And even the Karaites weren't as fundamentalist as the Christian fundamentalists today. The Bible was sort of like, hey, here's the puzzle to work it out. but I'm not giving you the answer clearly. So that means thought goes into even understanding that revelation, and that's what makes Torah unique in that regard. Yeah.
Well, just sort of playing on that, in the sense that you have an unfolding, as it were, of history. You have it, using the word evolution, but you have a progression of further elucidation, of application, of explanation that actually, is that seen as part of the divine process, or is it seen as, man mucking about with these things and taking a long time to get it? You have to take that approach just to Torah without then looking at everything else.
In Torah itself, it's clearly understood. Let's say Ramosha mentioned it in his perspective, is the Hagdil Torah Adira, that every Chiddush is a new development of the greatness of Torah, and it's a new insight into Torah. So we are constantly expanding our understanding of Torah. Right, and he says Lahagdil Torah, and someone once challenged him. He said a chiddush, and he said, "How can you come the halacha?" We're not going to Moshe Feinstein, who, when he said a chiddush, he's going to apply it lahalacha, and he got attacked. He says, "Where'd you come up with this chiddush? No other Achron says this. No other person says it. All of a sudden, you're going to go, what's your proof for this?" And Moshe writes, "I have a svara barura." In other words, it just logically makes sense. Okay? In other words, and chutz v'shalom that you should say that there's a kates to Torah. Right? L'hagdil Torah, you have to expand Torah. So the fact is there's that aspect. Now comes an interesting extension of that. Is how do you apply that in the further world, in the sense that you have development in science, you have development of new ideas outside of it, how do these development of ideas come back and affect Torah? Okay, when they say new ideas or something like that, and the point is that a further extension of that relationship. But at the key of that is you have to understand that tension between the aspect of revelation based upon authority and looking for the statement of authority versus the aspect of moving forward, which is at the root of the world. And the aspect what you've done correctly is brought this tension into Torah itself. So it's not by coincidence, for example, when I see different people involved in learning, I find it very interesting in the sense that, in terms of this styles of psak, that the style of psak I've seen from YU people are very different than the style of psak you'll see from someone from the more black hat yeshivas, in the sense that in the psak in the YU world, it's very much you think it through. You want to come up with the psak. In other words, you have to take it and make the decision. Well, much more in the yeshivish world, it's like go ask the Rosh Yeshiva or something like that, which is really a reflection of authority. Okay, in the sense that what this comes down to. See, it comes down to that you talk about authority from God. Well, there's no doubt the authority of God everyone's going to buy. Versus this movement forward. And as I pointed out, in Reform Judaism, they wanted to really deny that authority of God in a certain way. They just denied that God even spoke in that authority. But we have a problem also. That authority figure, who speaks for God today? So when you talk in terms of Torah, okay, I'm going to accept that God said this, but who's representing God today? You hear a lot of people say this, I don't care what the rabbi said, I want to know what God said. Well, then you're not Orthodox. That's not Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism says, well, lo b'shamayim, who makes that decision? So the Sanhedrin, the Gadol, and so forth and so forth. You have authority being passed on to people making these decisions, and so forth and so forth. Okay? So the truth is that the continuation of the authority figure comes up with concepts like Das Torah, the Rosh Yeshiva, the Gadol making decisions, Gedolim making decisions, and so forth. But against that is this other movement of saying, hey, you're supposed to be involved in the thinking process. So, an example is, therefore, when I see people from YU, and I'm not trying to say, they say everyone can make decisions, they don't say that, but they do try to advocate for more individual decision making. So, for example, I was speaking to Rabbi Dratch, who used to be at Shar Shemaim, whose father-in-law is Rabbi Lam, Chancellor of Yeshiva University. And he told me the following story. He said Rabbi Lam was speaking in Shar Shemaim, and Rabbi Lam told over the following story. Okay, Rabbi Lam says he had a shiloh, and he wanted to speak to the Rav, because Rabbi, about what he should do. So he went to Rabbi Shver and said, I have the Shala, what do you think? So Rabbi Shver started talking to him about the sugya, about the issues, right? And he basically gave Rabbi Lam a faher. It was okay, this issue, so Rabbi Lam knew the Rishonim, he knew the issues, and so forth and so forth. And so he said, this issue and that sheet, and so forth and so forth. So at the end of this discussion, Rabbi Shver saw that Rabbi Lam had the requisite, had all the information. So he says, Rabbi Shver said, okay, so you know the sugya, okay, fine. So Rabbi Lam says, but Rabbi, what should I do? So according to the story, Rabbi Shver said, you're a rabbi, go paskin. The Rav would not give the answer. Says, you have to, and the Rav was big in that, not liking the concept of das Torah, and this is something that comes out many, many times that you hear from stories of the Rav, that he really believed in, once you have the requisite knowledge to make a decision, to making decisions. What Rabbi Drach told me is there was Mishkiach there from COR, because there was an event there, and afterwards Mishkiach came into Rabbi Drach's office and said, you're following a story. I can't believe it. Is it true? Yeah, it's true. He says, a gadol doesn't answer a shaila? I can't understand that. Okay, because in the other world, it's the fact that you want the gadol to answer the story because you want to go back to authority. You want to have the aspect of authority. So the fact is that, and I remember once in a Jewish Observer, in that infamous Jewish Observer where they had that so-called hesped of the Rav, right, which was a travesty of modern Jewish history. The Jewish Observer published a hesped of the Rav. Rav was nifter, so they had to say something. So they published this travesty, and it's a one-page travesty. And they had Rabbi Joseph B. not Moraine Verbena Rabbi Goin. They had Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, Zal. Now, if you know anything about the Jewish Observer, everyone is Zatzal. This was Zal, right? And they didn't have it mentioned in the table of contents. It created a tremendous stir. Okay, I think it was Rav Tendler went to wrote an article in some place that totally tore it to pieces. And then Rav Soloveitchik came up. Anyways, it was that decision. What I heard is that really I heard that the Moitzes Gedolei Torah were not involved with that. They didn't know about that, and and there was a real issue in the Moitzes Gedolei. They all agreed that it was a travesty, but they didn't know how to respond. They didn't know because then it would mean we have to say we were wrong, and that was another problem. But I heard, from what I heard, there were members of the Moitzes Gedolei who said we have to retract immediately. Anyways, in that Jewish Observer, I remember reading another article, and there was an article about this person who Goyin Olam, Talmud Chacham, knew Shas by heart, knew everything. And you know what his greatest mila was? He never paskined. Whenever he had a shaila, whenever he had something, he always asked someone else. Right, because he always wanted to be makabel. He never wanted to make that decision. So you have that type of tension, but it moves from this concept of authority and this aspect that autonomy is really tied to wisdom. And really it reflects the fact that I want to be involved in the decision-making process. Now, in many ways, in this article over here, I point that really was the tension in the Slifkin affair. There were issues about whether they felt Rabbi Slifkin's presentations were correct, or there were Hashkafic issues, and so forth and so forth.
Creation book, or
it's interesting. There were two issues involved in the Slifkin affair. In Toronto, the big thing was the creation book, right? The fact that he didn't necessarily accept creation. It seems
the world wasn't 5,000 years old.
Right. But the fact is my understanding is that in Eretz Yisrael the issue was another book. It was in one of his other books, which is the only book Rabbi Slifkin I own, because I knew this was the issue, so I wanted to own that book. He basically talks about the relationship of Chazal to science, and he presents 5 different viewpoints within the Meforshim about science. Okay, and the one everyone got upset with is that he basically says he follows the position of Ramban and Rambam, who says that Chazal used the science of the age, right? Which was what a lot of people thought. Chazal made scientific statements, made psak based upon certain scientific statements because they used the science of the age. They weren't scientists. Other people got very upset with it. So it's something Chazal said, therefore it has to be Torah Misinai, and that was the real issue, because so I heard that the issue in Eretz Yisrael was the fact he said that he basically sided with the Rambam of Rambam, and Eretz Yisrael says, yeah, but that's not the Masorah, and the Masorah is everything Chazal says is absolutely correct, and their science is correct, and so forth and so forth. We've really left the whole issue there. But the truth is what really came down to, what it really came down to, it seems, was an issue of authority versus wisdom. That in the end, once people came out and said they don't like the book, then basically the argument was, how can you argue for the book? The authority came. It was no longer the issue of the book. It became the issue that the authority said A, and the defense of the book was, we're thinking. We have to, but involved in that thinking was also the aspect of this idea of we have to have some say in terms of autonomy. Now the truth is that the issue you're saying is I personally think that it really is part and parcel of Torah to really give autonomy. That the Torah itself, the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave revelation in a cryptic manner that he did, and I call it the cloudy revelation, it really demands of human beings to apply their minds and also to make decisions. Therefore, like for example, Rav Moshe says that machlokesim is an inherent nature of Torah. Okay, and therefore, and that in Torah there's going to be machlokesim in everything, because how could two people come to the same conclusions? They're all different people, and so forth and so forth. So Rav Moshe really brings in this aspect of autonomy in his understanding of learning. Now, there's issues you can't just say, well, he's saying that because of his personality. But what he's saying, what he's really saying is we're all called upon to think, and Torah itself is open to thought. Shivim Panim Torah is not just simply, listen, we can't get it right. We're not, really, if we were all really sharp, we'd all get it right. It really means that there are 70 different possibilities, and they all have value as Torah, and involved in it, which really brings out this aspect of intellectual development, plus also an aspect of autonomy, in the sense that you're choosing your way. So really, right at the beginning, when you choose a Rav, right, and that choosing a Rav is not because you asked a Shiloh. Right, because if you say it's a Shiloh, who are you asking the Shiloh to? But the choosing of a Rav is really your statement of autonomy. And at that point in time, you reckon every Rav can be different. So really there's a place of autonomy within Torah. But this question of autonomy and authority has become highlighted. It's really, this contemporary issue in Hashkafah is really just an issue in Hashkafah. That's what we're going to see with all the contemporary issues. It really is an inherent issue in Hashkafah. There's a balance in Hashkafah of authority and autonomy. And halachic issues in this, and so forth, which is inherent in Torah. Because the fact is the Torah, as Jordan said, wants you to take ownership, wants the Torah to become your Torah, which involves your own autonomy in terms of saying, this is mine, and therefore it's my chiddush, my development. This is my. You're supposed to take some balance on the Torah, but the point is, it's an issue in Torah. But the question is that can also challenge the authority model. But the point is, in our world today, especially after Reform, which really extended the aspect of autonomy within the Jewish world, and so forth and so forth, the world today it's become more of an issue because the world is basically has moved much more towards autonomy and the value of autonomy. Yeah.
There's a question of whether we see autonomy as a Jewish concept or as a foreign concept. That makes the difference as to how accepting or rejecting you are.
It's interesting as you say that. To me, it seems to be that there is aspects of autonomy in a certain way within Torah as a Jewish concept, but it's reinforced by the value of autonomy in the secular world. What I said, and I said this last week, is that
do you ever come across that word or that concept everywhere?
No.
That's what I'm saying. I think that's.
What do you mean? Anywhere in Torah or anywhere?
Torah and more.
You do. The fact is, they don't define it in terms of. They don't use the word autonomy, but they do talk about individual defining their own Torah in terms of making Torah your own in your own unique way. There is aspects to it not in the same term as autonomy. You don't find that term, because that's a term that came out of the Western world. But you do find the aspect of think it through and take bias yourself. So, for example, it will talk about the fact that an individual, if he comes to a certain psak, right, should follow his own psak. Okay, now there's issues about Rabbi and points and things of that nature, but the fact is, and there's a question of Zakin Mamre and so forth, but there is a concept that if you take, if in your situation, you have to have this aspect of your own decision, and you stand for what you stand for, and you are a certain type of individual, and it talks in terms of developing thought and your own individuality. So, and you see this expressed in many different hashkafas. I mean, the fact is for example, the Gra told Rav Chaim, it says if you really think you know something and you think this is your decision, then you have to follow what you believe, even connect everyone else.
But the point is, it's a question of, this is where I think the word autonomy is misleading. Like I'm thinking of the Rambam with his advice in the Moreh Nevuchim, which he gives to his Talmud, right? He wants his Talmud to develop his intellect, study all of the basic works that will help him do that. Before getting into these intricacies of Torah, he should know Aristotle, etc., etc.
Yeah,
so it's really a question of wisdom, and the reasoning is reasoning.
Right.
So in other words, there's a tradition of reasoning within Judaism, and it's the reasoning
it's interesting.
That leads you to making a decision and providing the backup to the decision. It's not just the question. I mean, modern day autonomy is not like that.
Okay, the fact
modern
is,
day autonomy is very superficial. It's very,
The fact is that you see, when they say that, when you say modern day autonomy is very superficial, it's because everyone thinks they have a right to an opinion.
That's right.
Right. You're right. And the example of that is an example I always point out. There was a TV show called L.A. Law. I don't know if you guys remember it. There was a guy who was what's the politically correct word for Benny? He was special challenger, or okay. And it was election was coming up, and one of the lawyers says to him, he was like a clerk in the law firm, and they said to him, Benny, you're going to vote, and he basically says, no, my mother says I'm too stupid to vote. I can't vote. So these lawyers says, no, you have a right to vote. Right? So the under theme of that show was getting betting on the voters list so you can vote. It was already after the primaries. You could vote. Say this is where we're going to get you on the list and so forth. And the show concludes with him going into the voters booth. Right? Now it sounds beautiful. It's a perfect one right, the right to vote. It's beautiful autonomy. But the fact of the matter is the person was like.
Do you understand the concept?
Did he really understand what the issues were? You know, like, do you want to do that? So the truth is that is superficial autonomy, and I agree with you. But the interesting thing is that when reasoning, you can have a machlokas in reason. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai were both reason, they had machlokas.
Right.
It's interesting because the Rambam as a rationalist is a little bit less comfortable with disagreements out of reason, because if you really got reason correct, you should really come to one conclusion. But other people were more comfortable because there was a little bit more of the recognition of personal distinctions. So you're right. Torah does not mean I'm right to opinion. You know, and which a lot of people say. You know, well, there's three opinions already, so why can't I have my own opinion? It's like the thing that always bothers me in Reform Hebrew schools, right? They have a program, right? Let's write our own medrash. You know, so you have 6-year-old or 8-year-old or 10-year-old kids. We're writing midrashim now. It shows you don't know what a medrash is about. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Oh, come up with your own idea out of nowhere. That's superficial autonomy. But we're pointing out, though, is that there's a difference between having knowledge and making decisions and accepting your own position, which is a reasoned position. It's not supposed to be like, I always get a kick out of this in terms of halacha. I think this halacha, so I'm going to do this. It's not that you like this halacha. It's you've really gone through the sugya and you think this is the proper understanding of the sugya. And there are situations where people who really do that, where they'll come to conclusions and they'll say, listen, this is the way I understand the halacha. Even against everyone else, l'chumra or away. And there's situations I, as a rabbi, would say, well, say to someone, say, you don't ask me that shiloh. Right? Why? Because my conclusion, looking through the sources, is going to lead to A. And I know that there are hundreds of rabbis out there who will give you a conclusion you'd be more happy with. So if someone comes to me with a shiloh of a certain nature, I'll say, you don't ask me that shiloh. The person will look at me, well, if you already know there's 5 other rabbis, one person once said it to me, I was asked a shiloh, I said, go ask that rabbi. Well, don't you respect that? Of course I respect that rabbi. So why don't you follow his opinion? Because that's not the opinion I come to. But I'm not going to but he's a rabbi, he has his own opinion. That's where you get into these issues of autonomy, which is somehow perhaps a little bit more supported if you are a little bit more open to the influences of the outside world. And that's where you find tension.
No, that's where I don't get it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a question of influences of the outside.
No, it's from Torah. It's from Torah.
I mean, why would you say that? I mean, it's just that if there are a certain knowledge out there that there wasn't before,
right.
You want to try to...
Right. I totally agree with you, but what I'm saying is that we live in a world where the general trend has some type of I don't want to say influence, but it's an aspect like.
Well, you have to reconcile. You're trying to reconcile.
Well, it's you see the word reconcile. I'm not trying to necessarily reconcile. In other words, we are. Like for example, the value of democracy. I remember the first time I said to someone, would a Jewish state have a value of freedom of religion? If you were going to create a halachic state, would you have the value of freedom of religion? And I remember giving a shit like that, and when I basically said there would be an issue, the guy was like shocked, because he is so inculcated from the world around him, and even in terms of the Jewish world. We've benefited from freedom of religion in Canada and America, right? We've benefited from it. We think it's a tremendous value. We think, and then you're going to tell me what, Al-Pi Torah, we would never apply that value? So the point is that if you are influenced by the world around you, and you've taken some influences, it's going to affect the way you think. Okay, but the truth is that doesn't mean I'm stipping this into Torah. In my learning of Torah, and the truth is, Moshe actually says that. Moshe says that there's more machlokas within Torah than there is in the outside world. He says when there's a machlokas in the outside of Torah, it's because someone doesn't know something. It's a lack of idea. Or he says it might be Gaido, it might be this. But in Torah, there's real honest aspects of disagreement. But the point is that it's become, the reason I include it as a contemporary issue is because although it's an issue within Torah itself, it really reflects some of the issues that are going on in the world today, and it's issues we have to deal with. Now the truth is, as I mentioned last week, is that in many ways the Torah hears values all around. In other words, the Torah perception of values is that there are many values out there and we have to balance them. There's the idea of good and evil is too simplistic. It's that there's different values, and everything that exists has its place. There's a place for anger. There's a place not for chesed. You have to know when to balance it, depending upon the circumstances and so forth and so forth. It's really a matter of balancing, and that's really what is tov, is getting the right answer in terms of that balance, and ra is the bad answer. The truth is when you go out to the world and you hear certain influences, basically what you see is that certain values are being highlighted, and that really Al-Pi Torah, those values aren't necessarily wrong. They're just being overemphasized in that particular situation. So basically, if you take that approach, you sit and say, listen, I understand why you're advocating for this. However, there's other issues to not advocate for this. But this makes you understand things a little bit differently. And the point is that in the contemporary world, there is an overextension of this issue of autonomy in reaction to the overextension of authority that existed prior to autonomy, because there was a tremendous amount of imposition in the world, not only imposition, inquisitions and so forth and so forth, which really came out of perception, I'm right, you're wrong. But the point is, if you really deal with the issue, you'll see that it is a Torah issue. And it goes into, and really where it goes into now is the authority of HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes out through Rabbanim today, what really is the authority of Rabbanim? There's an authority of Sanhedrin. The question is, without the Sanhedrin, no doubt the Sanhedrin, decision of Sanhedrin had absolute authority. Now we work in the world today is whether Rabbanim have a similar type of authority.
I have a question. Did anyone ever do a study of how, let's say, all the Meforshim and the going back, how the era that they lived in, how that would have affected their views and their positions on certain
the issue is a very, very challenging issue, because you see, in conservative Judaism, I don't know the book myself, but I think that I think it was Chancellor Finkelstein wrote a book on the Hillel and Shammai, on the Pharisees or whatever, and in it he basically presents the Beis Shammai as patricians and Beis Hillel as plebeians, and basically presents that their viewpoints were actually tied to their political goals, and that was really very, very problematic to Orthodoxy. There is a tension in the sense that no doubt you are affected by the world around you, but there's a tension to say that this is the kind of decision he made because he acted this way. Like, for example, people try to say that Rabbi Meir, who had a very Rabbi Meir had a very strong, let's say, quote unquote, negative attitude towards women. They say he must have had a terrible marriage life and so forth. The truth was he was married to Bruria, so they say, you see, he didn't like his wife because his wife was strong with him and so forth. To the marriage, he liked his wife because his wife was actually a thinker. The point is but there's all the attempt to say this rabbi says this because he had this life and this that. And that really upsets classic Orthodox thinking. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't say it. I heard one Rav, for example, presents the aspect. I heard him say this, and he said it sort of to a few guys after a shir. He said, I won't say this like really publicly, but he says there's a big machlokas between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim in the relationship to the Karaites. In the Sephardic world, the Karaites were pretty well accepted, and there was interaction between the two communities. The Karaites are the is the sect that rejected the oral law, rejected Torah Shabbat Peh. No, the Sadducees had a similar value. There's a difference between the two of them. I'm really not up on the difference. But the Karaites was around 7th century, 8th century. Sadducees around the 2nd century BC.
Which is the sect that doesn't pass the lamb in Israel?
Samaritans. Yeah. Okay. So the fact is that the Karaites, they were big in Germany and Cairo, and the Sephardim related to them. And if a Karaite wanted to do tshuva and enter into the community, we accept it. The Ramah Paskins up in Europe, in the Crimea, there was a big Karaite community in Korea. And by the way, there are, if you Google Karaite, you'll see that there is a lot of Karaite websites out there, and there are Karaite synagogues. Somewhere in California, there's a couple. Today, and also in Jerusalem, Karaites are accepted under the law of return in Israel. So what happened was the Ramah Paskins, that because they didn't have proper rabbinic supervision of their gittin, their kedushains were good kedushains, because kedushin just happens because there's a kol that they're married, but their gittins were not good gittins, and therefore there's a strong possibility they're all mamzerim, and therefore there's an assumption that they may be mamzerim. Therefore he basically said Karaites cannot enter into Kal, because they're all potential mamzerim. So it was a very big rift between the Karaites and the Jews in the Crimea versus in Egypt. So the fact is that he concludes. So this Rav says, but if you look at it, he says, so the Ramah says we're not going to take him in, and the Egyptians did take him in. He says it may have a lot to do with the relationship between the two communities. In Egypt there was a relationship between the communities. In Crimea they hated each other. So it might be there was so much friction in the Crimea, that this may have affected the Ramah's talking. But he says, I'm not going to say that though, because you don't want to say that about the Ramah that was affected by his halakhic decision was affected by the situation.
Or even other influences in terms of the other dominant culture
Right.
of, at least at the time, Islam being a little more respectful
Right.
of different religions, and the Christians who were
Right.
highly intolerant at
Right.
the time.
It's all part of workings, but the fact is, this is part of the issue. But the point is, this is one classic issue in contemporary times. It really is a Torah issue in Hashkafah, and from the articles I gave you, especially this article on authority and wisdom, you can see some of the issues.